All right. Hello. Welcome back to another episode of the CANiVISION Midwest podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jackson.
Tatiana Grant. Hey, everybody.
Hey, happy to be here downtown Detroit, per usual, at the beautiful Foundation Hotel. Always a pleasure being here. We appreciate them having us. And there was some big news out of Washington. So we're going to hop right into the episode, right? Budding policies. There's some big news out of Washington. The MORE Act, about this time last week, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, known to many of you as the MORE Act, passed the House of Representatives last week in historical fashion. And there's a couple of things that you should probably know about the MORE Act. Let me start there, right?
Okay, educate us.
So for those of you who don't know exactly what the MORE Act is, and this is broad strokes, the first thing that it would do is it would decriminalize cannabis, meaning it wouldn't be considered a substance one drug anymore, similar to the likes of heroin and cocaine, which is odd to even be putting cannabis in the same conversation as those substances.
Right.
But what's crazy is that it wasn't that odd 10 or 20 years ago to just consider it a substance one drug, but that's a whole nother thing. It would also allow for expungements, which is a big deal. And it would provide a 5% tax, I think, on products, if I understand that correctly, a 5% tax on products to go toward criminal and social programs to provide grants and aids for communities that were negatively impacted by the war on drugs. Okay?
Yeah.
There's also some provisions and amendments and things like that, one of which that says that felons aren't allowed to participate. Former felons at that time wouldn't be allowed to participate in the industry, even if you were investigated. Now, for those of you who are watching and listening, if that sounds like some BS, it's because it is. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Who better, though, than our friend and an ally to the industry to have a conversation about this topic and more. So allow me to introduce Michigan State Representative Yousef Rabhi out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Yousef, how are you doing today, my guy?
I am doing very well. Thank you to both of you for inviting me to be on your program today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and I appreciate you, man. I know you're wrapping up the year at the Capitol, trying to get some things done as much as you can. So we appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to have this important conversation. So your thoughts, if you don't mind, if I start with you, your thoughts on the MORE Act, generally speaking, and what it means really as someone that is a pro-cannabis elected official.
Yeah. And thank you for starting the conversation off that way. You know, a few things. First of all, I want to talk about since I'm a state legislator and, not somebody who's voting on that congressional action, I just want to talk about how I see that congressional action in the context of, the states too, right? Because a big part of it, if I understand correctly, is really devolving regulatory authority on marijuana to states, because it's removing it as a Schedule 1 substance at the federal level. So pushing it down to the states to regulate that matter. I think that's really important. And I think that around this issue, that could be one of the most, the biggest positives when it comes to this bill, in terms of pushing that regulation off to the states. Now, there's a lot obviously that Michigan's been doing in this space. You've probably had many conversations about this. One of my biggest concerns, though, around both the legislation at the federal level and around what's happening at the state level is, really the issue around, how we're dealing with, those who have felony convictions or any type of criminal record around cannabis, both people that are currently incarcerated and people that are formerly incarcerated. and really how we treat those individuals within the context of the cannabis market. In my ideal world, we would actually have a scenario where those that were convicted or have a criminal record around cannabis would be some of the first people to be promoted into the industry, to be given to a lower bar to access the industry. Because or else what we're looking at, frankly, is, I mean, I think it's important, whenever I talk about it, I talk about this, there is a racist dynamic to not having that. Because when you look at who was jailed, put in prison, who got citations and tickets, it was disproportionately not white people. And yet when we look at the industry as a whole and who's in it now, it is vastly disproportionately white. And so, and where that rubber hits the road for me is the fundamental discrepancy that was created the day that we legalized cannabis in the state of Michigan, where you had individuals that were participating in the industry in an illicit way, that, overnight the activities that they were doing theoretically became legal, but because they didn't have the capital to sort of buy into the system, what they were still doing is still illegal. So how do we make sure to break down those barriers? And I think one of the ways that we should be proactively doing that is actually going after the people that did something that is currently legal,
right,
but they just did it before the date that we passed the ballot measure. They did something that's currently legal, and we punish them as a society. And now I think it's time that we make amends and try to, repair what damage society has done by punishing that person and actually giving them an opportunity to succeed in what is now a legal commercial market for cannabis. So I think that's a matter that the federal government should deal with, but I also, more importantly, think that's a matter that the state government needs to deal with. And I've been advocating for that. And I think that's a really important piece of what we need to be looking at. So overall, I support what the federal government's doing. I think it gives us a lot more flexibility at the state level. A lot of work that still needs to be done, though.
Go ahead. What are your thoughts?
No, I was just gonna say, I'm always having these debates with, friends that are in the industry. Do you think that, obviously this seems to be a first step, but again, it's pushing it down to the state level. At what point do you think that this really becomes decriminalized across the board?
So that is an interesting debate, right? And that's something that we've been actually talking about in my office quite a bit, because it becomes a question of what do you sacrifice? I mean, so on the one hand, you could just say across the board, we're going to deschedule, cannabis for everything.
Mm-hmm.
The impact of that is that then it basically upends the regulated market, right? And because a lot of the current laws that say, you have to get a license in order to, to sell cannabis in the state of Michigan,
right,
unless you're doing it at a certain level. A lot of that is tied to the fact that it is at least regulated. It doesn't have to be a Schedule I, right? But it has to be some type of mention in the law that it's illegal to sell cannabis at a certain volume without a license.
right.
And if you don't have that, then it basically becomes,
Free game.
a free game. Anybody can sell whatever.
Right.
And so it's kind of that balance of, do we want to completely remove it and say we're not going to mention cannabis in the law at all, in which case there would be no need for the MMFLA or MRTMA or any of that, or any business licenses. No licensing would be needed. Or is there like a middle ground where we can decriminalize it in in most criminal contexts, but that there's still some civil and legal action that can be taken on businesses that are going above and beyond what the law prescribes. So it's going to take some work in order to get to that middle ground, if that's what we want.
Right.
I know that there's people of different opinions in this space, though.
Got it.
Yeah, and the question is, who are the winners and losers, right? Big win for the cannabis industry in its entirety. That provision, that amendment that I was alluding to, that would prevent, to Rep. Roby's point that would prevent former felons from even being able to participate in the industry. I happen to know that that was, and others know too, that that was a provision that was added because of a carbon copy from other industries like tobacco and alcohol, that are going to give, it's going to give us an opportunity. The industry is going to have an opportunity for their concerns to be heard in the next session, right? And that came from, can't speak too much on it, but it came from, you know, the chairs of the Cannabis Caucus in DC. So while people were up in arms, and rightfully so, because we have to continue to apply the pressure, right? You just can't do things like that and then no one says anything about it, and then we expect that it's going to be better and or changed. But as it stands, that's where it's moving to. So that's one of the things that I think was an issue, that is an issue that will get resolved, as you know, Rep. Roby, like as you
can just call me Yousef. That's okay.
All right, cool. Appreciate it, Yousef. As you do bills, there are iterations of them, right? And sometimes it has to look a certain way for it to pass, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what it's going to be like at the end of it all.
Right.
The other part, though, is the act is just what it is. It's an act. And so the framework for an actual bill, right, has to be built around it. And the question is, what is that framework going to look like? So when you say communities that have been disproportionately negatively impacted by the war on drugs, like what does that actually mean, right? You have to define it. It does us no good for the federal government at this point to come to a state like Michigan or California or others and say, we know what's best, so your entire cannabis legislation needs to look like the following, right? Because you have states who have been dealing with it since 2014 or 15, right? In our case. And so those are the types of conversations that need to be had. But regardless, it was a very historical moment. I think there is a victory lap to be had for the cannabis industry. I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's just one of 100 steps, right, in order for us to get to where we're trying to get to. So I appreciate your perspective on that. So let's find out a little more about you while we have you, because it's the reason for the show. So,
right. We like to back it on up. Can you just tell us a little bit about your journey into politics?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So grew up in Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor area, was actually born in Ypsilanti. And started, what's that?
I said I went to Eastern, so very familiar.
Nice. Okay, so I was actually born in a house just down the street from Eastern, in like the Normal Park neighborhood.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, so started off in Ypsi. My family moved to Ann Arbor, went to Ann Arbor Public Schools, and actually, this is gonna go back a little ways, but my first political experience was actually in preschool, and my preschool teacher was very nature-based, right? So we spent a lot of time outside. We spent a lot of time every day, actually. We were out, rain or shine or snow or whatever, we were outside. And we actually adopted a segment of a creek in Ann Arbor, and we would go down and study the creek, the sedimentation, the pollution, the insects. We would be, and we partnered with the Huron River Watershed Council. And we learned about how, when it rains, the pollution runs into the creek and impacts the health and the quality, and how urbanization and parking lots and cars and rooftops and all of that interacts with creating, how our built environment interacts with our natural environment. And so we created something called the Burr Park Wet Meadow Project, where we actually cultivated native indigenous plant species that we planted in this large park near the preschool to soak up all of that water that rained down, to soak up the pollution and the car oils and all that stuff before it got to our creek, to create a more natural and a healthy environment in our own community. And what that really taught me was that everything that we do has an impact, and that if we want to create change, we got to start literally in our own backyard. And sometimes it's as fundamental as rolling up our sleeves and digging in the dirt. And so from there, I feel like I grew into a passion for activism, and that grew to a passion for peace and justice activism. When I was in college, I was a social justice and peace activist, especially against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, attending a lot of protests, organizing, protest forums, teach-ins, that kind of thing. I also got involved, obviously, in environmental activism. In some, I worked closely with SSDP at the University of Michigan. Then I also did a lot of labor organizing, work with, fighting for the rights of workers, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And that culminated with a sit-in that we actually conducted in the president of the university's office. We were protesting the fact that the University of Michigan doesn't use humane conditions in the production of its apparel. And we wanted the university to hold itself to a higher standard. So we sat in the president's office, we refused to leave, and 12 of us were arrested as a result of that. So there was a picture of me on the front page of the Michigan Daily in handcuffs, being hauled out of the administrator's office over this protest that we did. So that was kind of what got it all started. A few years later, my predecessor, Jeff Irwin, decided to run for state representative. He was vacating a county commission seat. I ran for that county commission seat, won my first election by one vote in 2010, August of 2010, that first election I ever had. One single vote put me over the line. It was 2 votes after the recount, so I doubled my margin of victory about a month later when we did the recount. And I served my first term on the County Board of Commissioners, 2011, 2012. Came back second term. I served as chair of the board in 2013, 2014. Came back a third term in 2015 and 2016, and that's when I actually ran for state representative. Jeff Irwin was term limited in the state house, so opened up a seat there. Ran for rep. Won in 2016, started in January of 2017, served on the Appropriations Committee in my first term, and then I was reelected to the State House in 2018. I was elected to be the Democratic floor leader, which is sort of the one of the top 2 leadership positions in the House. Served as Democratic floor leader all of this term, and was just reelected to a second term or a third term. And will be returning as the Democratic floor leader again in my third and final term in the State House.
Well, congrats. That's quite the journey.
It's a good resume.
That, started from the preschool days. As
Right.
you were saying it to me, I'm like, that is so Ann Arbor. I love it.
I know, right? You got to start in the dirt, and I'm okay. I can acknowledge, I'm totally Ann Arbor on this, so that's fine.
So you mentioned that you were going into your final term, right, as a state representative here in Michigan, and you've done some really good things from my perspective. So you were elected probably before. I mean, I'm sure cannabis was a conversation, but it didn't have nearly the amount of gusto, right, and momentum that it has in the last 3 to 4 years or something like that, right? So what's your experience in being a pro-cannabis elected official, right? And just to put it in perspective, I was also, I ran as a pro-cannabis candidate, but, the city in which I ran, especially when you have older generations that are the people who are voting, have a certain perspective of the industry, or at least had a certain perspective of the industry 4 years ago. What's your experience being as a pro-cannabis candidate and elected official, for that matter?
I think that's a great question. I would say this. I think initially it was more challenging before we passed Prop 1. I think I was, people would kind of, so let me start. Being from Ann Arbor and being from a community that has a long history back to this, 60s and before with cannabis, people associate Ann Arbor with, cannabis, with hash bash, with those kinds of things.
Yes.
And so
my favorite thing from Fleetwood's is the hippie hash. So
yes. Yes, so good. So good. So there's a lot of culture and a lot of attention there. So when I got to Lansing, I was the Ann Arbor rep. Cannabis was just woven into my identity. whether I, advocated proactively for that to happen or whether people just ascribed it to me, but I owned it, and I thought, but a lot of other people, especially Republican members, were very, whether they felt that they had to be or whether they actually believed it themselves, were very distant from the cannabis issue. And it wasn't until Prop 1 passed that I think cannabis became, something that they accepted a little more. Even some of the members that I think themselves maybe were okay with it, but outwardly felt that they had to be not okay with it because they thought that was how their district wanted them to be. They saw that the voters approved it, and I think the minute that the voters signed off and said, no, we want this, even some of the folks that were trying to be hidden about it kind of came forward and were willing to be a little bit more upfront. So on the whole, I would say that most of the legislature is now what some may describe as pro-cannabis, or at least is supportive of, of cannabis in some light. But I think that's where we need to redefine really what pro-cannabis means, right? Because, or at least define it in a better way, because it's, what I've seen is that you start creating these kind of buckets of pro-cannabis, or people that, say that they're supporting the cannabis industry or cannabis users. Who are you out there advocating for, right? And so you see that there's this, obviously there's still the folks that are just against it. They don't support it. They don't think it should happen. They're going to vote no on anything that involves cannabis right off the bat, right? And there's probably 10, 20 hardcore Republicans, maybe one or two Democrats that are, in that boat. And then you have the folks that are more, I would call like corporate cannabis, who are really out to support the big dogs in the industry, that want to support, and frankly, they're all, again, white and they're all male, but the large growers, large manufacturers, large scale, maybe even some out-of-state folks. And there's a pretty significant contingent, I think, of those types of people. And then you have kind of the folks that support, a diverse and broad legalized, cannabis industry that has room for a lot of small business owners and startups and people of diverse, racial backgrounds, but not really, a vision for how that happens, but just a sort of an overall belief that we're in an okay. They support cannabis legalization. They support diversity in the industry. They support small businesses. And I would say that kind of straddles like the edge of the Republicans and most of the Democratic caucus. And then on the very far other side, you have a group that I think is really laser focused on equity and justice in the cannabis space, and that is focused on, really trying to push for not just equality in the cannabis market, but equity in the cannabis market, and really trying to repair some of the wrongs that have been done from a criminal justice background, and really saying that, it's not okay for these, 5 big manufacturers to run the industry, that we need to have diversity, not just from a small business background, but from, we need to go and make sure that the individuals that were unfairly detained, that had criminal records created, that were actually going and saying, we want you in the industry and we're going to break down every barrier possible to make sure that you can be in the industry to participate as an owner of, of a business or, whatever it is, to help, get their feet back on the ground. So I think, and I think people in that space are more along the lines of as well, trying to deschedule or reschedule, cannabis, are really trying to, break down a lot of barriers for home grow and protecting home grow, and really pushing for as well, patients' rights in, more of the medical space, that kind of thing. So I would describe that as kind of the spectrum. So I'd say like probably 75% of the legislature is some level of pro-cannabis, but it falls into one of those buckets.
Got it.
And I may have missed a bucket. It's oversimplification, but that's, I think, generally how I see things.
I got you.
So going a little deeper into that that messaging of pro cannabis, can you share or speak to some of the pro cannabis legislation that that we may or may not be seeing in the upcoming months?
Yeah. So, I guess which bucket do you want me to? Because there's kind of stuff going on in each category, and so
Let's start with the clean. Let's start with the clean slate bill. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds good. So I'd say that's there's a lot going on around a lot of. I would say there's a lot of effort, at least a lot of push going around the criminal justice aspect of things, and clean slate is probably the biggest win that we've had in the legislature this term. And for those of you that don't know about these bills, it was a package of 7 bills that goes to actually change how the state of Michigan deals with basically criminal records. Up until these bills passed in the state of Michigan, if you had more than 1 felony, if you had more than 2 misdemeanors, you were not allowed to get your record expunged, which means that a lot of people were walking around with criminal records, could not get jobs, could not get housing. And so we were creating basically a class of people that were just had no other options. I mean, if you can't get a job and you can't get housing, what are you going to do, right? And so it creates a huge impact on, recidivism, on homelessness, on other issues, which then leads to, a whole slew of health issues as well. So as a society, this small legal issue was creating a huge ripple effect for individuals across the state of Michigan. And the way that even if you could get your record expunged, even if you did only have 1 felony and only 1 or 2 misdemeanors, you needed to hire a lawyer in order to get your record expunged. And if you can't have it, if you can't find a job and if you don't have a place to stay, how are you going to afford an attorney to go to court to get your record expunged? It was just a ridiculous situation that really favored those that had resources beforehand. And it was basically for a system that favored the rich, which is how most of our criminal justice system works. And so as of before the bill passed, we estimated that over 90%, actually closer to 94% of those, even with an eligible record for expungement, did not get their record expunged because they either didn't know or they didn't have the resources to get that expungement. So what these 7 bills did is a combination of things. First off, if it increased the number of felonies and misdemeanors that you could have on your record and still get your record expunged. And so you can now have more felonies, more misdemeanors, as long as they're non-violent felonies and misdemeanors. You can also, one of the other provisions is there was a wait time. You had to wait a certain period of time before you could actually apply for expungement, even if you had those that, just 1 felony and 2 or less misdemeanors. You still had to wait. It was a huge waiting period, sometimes up to 10 years. We reduced that wait time. So now people don't have to wait as long. The other important aspect here was we included formerly non-expungible offenses as expungible, including a lot of driver's offenses, driver's felonies, driver's misdemeanors were included, and then cannabis. So unfortunately, this bill didn't go as far as people like myself and Senator Irwin wanted, but we are now able to expunge certain cannabis-related felonies and misdemeanors, but not all cannabis-related felonies and misdemeanors. So that was a step in the right direction. Didn't go far enough, but at least we're moving in the right direction. One of the hallmark bills, though, in this package, and one of the biggest things that it did, was it created an automatic expungement process, which means that now, if you're eligible for expungement, if you've waited the period of time, if you've committed less than the number of felonies, less than the number of misdemeanors, which has, been increased, you don't have to go and hire an attorney to go to court to petition for expungement. Your record will be cleared automatically through the state's system, which means that as of the passage of the bill, once they take effect, on the day that they take effect, anybody in the state of Michigan who is currently today eligible for expungement but hasn't been expunged because they can't afford an attorney, those 94% of people, their records will be automatically expunged, which means overnight, we're anticipating that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Michiganders with a criminal record will no longer have a criminal record and can go seek employment, housing, etc., without the fear of that issue. So we need to be, very proactive about messaging that, because a lot of people may not even know, right, that they may be resigned to the fact that they have a criminal record, and they may not even know that this bill passed. So we need to be proactive about messaging that. There's a lot of other stuff that the bills do. I can go into that, but that's the overview of expungement. It was a huge win. It was bipartisan. It passed the House and the Senate. I had a bill in the package. My bill was on the wait times, reducing the wait times. So a lot of great work there. And there's a lot of other stuff that's going on too, which I'm happy to go into.
Well, no, and I appreciate that, just because, to your point, most people don't know, right? The general public wouldn't necessarily know that good work is being done, right? Far too there's a lot of times in the media does a thing where, eyeballs are glued to the negative things versus the positive things that are happening. You know what I mean? So while sometimes I can even be skeptical of government, generally speaking, right, it's not to say that good things aren't happening. And so I appreciate you sharing that perspective. I made a comment last week on the show, and feel free to debunk this myth, if it's a myth. I made a comment last week that nothing good comes out of lame duck.
You did say that. I do remember that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just traditionally, I don't think anything good comes out of lame duck. It's usually a time when one party or the other that's in control tries to do what they can to push through the legislation that's on their priority list, especially if the leaders are outgoing, right, and you have new incumbent leaders from that party. So debunk that, right? Please. Do you generally agree that good things don't come out of lame duck, or can you tell me something different?
I would say that based on our experience over the past decade, you are 100% correct. Mm-hmm. I would say that generally speaking, though, if you think about lame duck as an idea, it really depends on whether the people that you like are in power or not, right? Mm-hmm. Because lame duck can also be a time when, transformative legislation is passed by the right people. That having been said, in the state of Michigan, that typically has not been the case because, over the last decade, we've seen really, really bad legislation coming out of lame duck. I will add that I am a Democrat. I believe in democratic values. I believe that if Democrats were in charge during lame duck, better things would have happened. That having been said, I am first and foremost a Michigander, an American, somebody who believes in our democracy. And I personally believe that lame duck is bad for our democracy, regardless of who is in control of the state house or the state senate or the governor's office during that period of time. What lame duck basically is, I'm sure that you explained it last time, but I just want to emphasize, lame duck is the period of time after the election before the end of session. So the election happens in early November, and by then we know everybody that won, everybody that lost, and there's this period of time, it's basically a 2-month period until the end of the calendar year before the new session. So all the new people that won office in November don't start until January of the following year. So there's that 2-month period where the people who maybe lost their election or the people who are not running for re-election or who are term limited have this basically free reign, this 2-month free reign where they don't care about what the voters think. Right. They don't care about their re-election because they're not on the ballot.
Right.
And even the people that are going to be maybe on the ballot in the future don't care as much because they feel that the voters are paying less attention during that period. So they feel that they can pass all the junk that they thought maybe was politically volatile before, that they could get it all done during this period. So I just believe, regardless of which party is in control, that this is just a bad period because I believe in public accountability. I believe that there should never be a time in government when elected officials feel that they can just do whatever they want and not care about how the public reacts. That's just not good governance. And so I've actually co-sponsored multiple pieces of legislation that would change our state constitution to basically, in various forms, eliminate lame duck. One of them flat out says the legislature has to adjourn sine die, which means without a day, which means that's the end of the legislature. There's no more session days that year, right after the election. There's a bill that does that. There's also a bill that says anything that comes up during lame duck would have to receive a supermajority vote in order to pass. I think that's also good policy. If we're still going to have a lame duck, you should have to have every bill passed by a 2/3 majority, or else it doesn't become law. I think that's a good one too. So there's a lot of good ideas circulating around out there. They're bipartisan. You know, there's Republicans and Democrats that think lame duck is lame, and we're trying to reform it, trying to change it, because as you said, there's nothing good that comes out of lame duck, and we've seen that over the last decade in the state of Michigan.
And to be fair, the pendulum swings, right? Because I also believe that if people weren't thinking about being reelected as much as they are, then maybe better decisions can be made in that process as well, right? So it goes both ways, to be fair. But yeah, I think lame duck is a lame thing generally. So be careful though, talking about changing people's constitution, because that's a problem.
So at the end of the day, I mean, it is also important to note that any change to the Constitution cannot be made by the legislature. We can propose it, right, but the public ultimately, the people of the state of Michigan control our Constitution. Right. And so the legislature can put it on the ballot, but the voters ultimately decide. So if the voters think lame duck's a good thing, it would stay, we would keep having lame duck. Now, I will say we never voted on those resolutions because the Republican leadership doesn't want those to come up. They don't want them to go to the voters. So they haven't been put on the ballot yet, but they're proposals at this point.
And why would the party in charge ever want to put themselves in a position where they didn't have control? So, okay, good.
Exactly.
Oh, go ahead.
Exactly. So, you know, it definitely sounds like you are doing such meaningful and impactful work in your day-to-day, just the work that you're doing. What would you say you want your legacy to be when you are retired or when you're making that transition? What do you want your legacy to be?
Yeah, I mean, you know, to some degree, that's a great question. To some degree, in a specific sense, I feel that expungement bill was legacy change, you know, that I was able to help get across the finish line. And so in some ways, it's like, I will always remember those bills as a significant thing that I helped to do for people in the state of Michigan. But in a broader sense, there's a lot more that I still have to do, that I still want to do, that has to do with criminal justice reform, but also that's some other issues as well in the healthcare space. I have been an advocate and a champion for single-payer universal healthcare for years. I think this pandemic that we're in has shown how racist, how disproportionate, and how economically segregated our healthcare system is. And it shows that, you know, there are disparities that run through the veins of our society that need to be solved. And having a healthcare system that makes sure that everybody is covered, that ensures that healthcare is a basic human right, is something that we can afford as a country, and we can't afford not to do from a social justice standpoint, in my opinion. And so that's something that I want to keep fighting for. And, you know, I'm 32 years old now. I'm hopeful that I can stay involved in politics, stay involved in public service, and hopefully we'll see a day when that becomes the law of our nation, or at least the law of our state. And, you know, I want to keep pushing for that. That would be another, you know, legacy thing for me as well. The environment's a big issue. I would like for us to get to zero carbon emissions in the state of Michigan. I've introduced legislation to create a 100% renewable energy portfolio for the state of Michigan. We're at, I think, 15% now. It's abysmally low. So that would be, you know, a legacy that I would look back on. At the end of the day, though, big picture, what I care about most is ensuring the sanctity of the citizens of our state of Michigan, ensuring that our democracy is strong. And that transcends, like I said earlier, it transcends party, it transcends all of that. I identify first and foremost as a legislator of the people, not a legislator of one party or the other. I am a legislator of the people, and I want my legacy to be that I stood up and fought for the people when others wouldn't, and when there was a lot of force from, the corporate sphere, from, big business pushing a certain direction. We need more people in Lansing. We need more people in the halls of government that are going to say what matters most is what is important to the people of our state, not what's important to the stakeholders and the lobbyists.
Awesome.
Dope. Well, look, man, I per usual, I appreciate our interactions. Always learn from them. It's always insightful, and I think we get smarter every time that we have an opportunity to have these types of discussions. You know what I mean? So thank you for your time this morning. I know you're busy and you're off to the next meeting. I just want to say, per usual, to all of the folks who joined us today, thank you for your support, every like, every subscribe, every comment, mention. We can't do it without you all, and we just hope to keep adding value. So Yousef, thanks again for coming, and we look forward to having our next discussion down the road a little bit. So,
thank you both for having me here. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.